episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine. Christopher Cannan has worked in the international wine business for more than 50 years, representing some of the greatest producers through his company Europvin, as well as making his own wine, Clos Figueras, in the Catalan region of Priorat. Fluent in at least 4 different European languages, he's a Bordeaux-based citizen of the world who can look back over the last century with a sharp eye and palate and a wry sense of humour. Hello, Christopher. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure and an honour.
I'm speaking to you from Bordeaux, aren't I? Or you're in Bordeaux. I'm not.
Yes, exactly. I'm in Bordeaux at the moment.
And I mean, what's the En Primeur campaign going to be like this year, do you think?
Complicated, to say the least. It does mean a major shift in the strategy. I think from the most of the big chateaus, they need to work on their pricing.
Yeah, bring them down a bit, I think, really. Yeah. Listen, you've got this unbelievable overview of the world of fine wine. Reading your autobiography, which was a joy to read, I must say. But you've done so much, I couldn't believe it. But I want to start, as I always do, with people's beginnings, because you were born in Gloucestershire, and you were sent away to boarding school at the age of 8. I just wondered, you've been a big traveller, you've been a very independent-minded person all your life. Did that affect you in a way, do you think, being sent away to school so young?
I think so, yes. I went first of all to a prep school at 8 years old and then to a boarding school in Milton Abbey in Dorset. I guess it does affect one. It makes one, I think, more independent as one grows up. And as you say rightly in your question, perhaps more intrepid and more willing to take risks.
Yeah, you've never been frightened of doing new things, especially in new places, just getting on a plane going somewhere, right?
Yes, I've always been fascinated by geography and travelling and so that's always been a factor in my career.
Have you ever done a list of all the places you've been to?
No, I've never done a list, but there are quite a few. It's a long list.
I ran out of fingers to count them all on by the time I got to the end of the book. I think you've sold wine everywhere.
Yeah, almost everywhere where one can sell wine, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the autobiography, A Journey in the World of Wine, you say in there that your family had no connection to wine and it was a luxury they could ill afford. But were they foodies? I mean, did they still drink a bit of wine? They must have done, did they?
They did, yes, they did. But those days, it was the 1950s. I remember the odd bottle of Hirondelle appearing and the odd bottle of Lutema Riesling at the time. Foodies, no, but they had a huge vegetable garden and we ate very healthy food, that's sure. But I can't say that they were exactly foodies. Of course, it was a period after the war, which was not a very auspicious time for foodies. But anyway, we did see a few bottles of wine on the table of what you could buy in those days in the countryside, and that was about all you could get. It was Hirondelle and Lutema Riesling and Blue Nun. I mean, brands like that.
Yeah, exactly. Do you remember when you tasted good wine? I mean, for the first time, because I know you went to France on an exchange. Were you sort of 15 or 16 then when you went to, I think it was Normandy, wasn't it?
Yes, it was Normandy, but they were drinking, it was a lovely family, but they were drinking very ordinary wines with the star bottles litre bottles of Plonk, basically. No, when I my first tasting of a proper wine, which really inspired me, was the tasting that Kit Stevens organised at Milton Abbey, and he opened a bottle of Peace Porter, Goldtropfen, among other wines. And there was a Medoc and various other things. But the Peace Porter one that struck me as being particularly good, perhaps, because when one starts drinking wine, one likes to drink wines which are a bit sweet, and that was the case with this wine.
And that was a Riesling, presumably, was it?
That was a Riesling from the Peace Porter, yes.
Yeah. I mean, Kit Stevens, legendary master of wine, no longer with us, sadly, anymore, because he was a great character. He always said, to make great wine, you need to know what great wine tastes like. So he believed in tasting great wines and even showing it to you. What were you, 16 at the time when you had that bottle of wine?
16 at the time, yes. We were a group of about 10 pupils who attended that event.
So who invited him to the school? Was he an old boy at the school? Or?
Yes, well, I was probably... No, I didn't think he was an old boy. I think the headmaster... I think the headmaster liked wine because I know his son, his son-in-law, son and grandson, who are both making wine today in the Priorat.
I mean, quite enlightened of a headmaster to show a bunch of 16-year-olds, some top wines, isn't it?
Yes, but I guess in those days people were less as reserved about alcohol than they are today.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It's interesting that you talk in your autobiography that you said you nearly went to university in Perth in Australia. Whose idea was that? Was it your dad's idea?
No, it was. I wasn't particularly clever at school, and I scraped through O levels and A levels and so on. But one of my teachers was insistent that I should go to university, and since that my scores weren't very high, that was the one university we could find. But what happened with that was I was supposed to go by ship, and the ship wasn't going to leave for 3 months, and that's when my father sent me to Lausanne to learn French and make those 3 months useful. And so that's what happened. But I became so hooked on learning languages that I spent altogether 9 months in Switzerland and in Lausanne learning French, followed on by almost a year in Germany, and especially in Cologne, but also in Bavaria, and then 6 months in Madrid learning Spanish. So that was all very useful for my career, and it's been useful ever since.
So I mean, that was your university in a way, was it? Traveling to these places, living in Switzerland.
Yes, exactly. Then that ended up being in language schools rather than the university.
Yeah, and probably more useful than going to Perth in Western Australia.
Probably, yes. Certainly with a follow-up in my career.
So you went to Switzerland, you went to Germany, and you went to Spain. Anywhere else on that particular bit of your life, that tour?
No. There was just those 3 countries. Subsequently, I also learned some Italian as well. It's not my strongest language.
I mean, did you not realise you didn't realise you had a facility for languages when you at school then?
No, we didn't have very good teachers. I don't think my French teacher was so bad that when I arrived in Switzerland, I discovered that the French I had learned was 17th century, 18th century French. So everybody laughed at me.
So you were speaking like Racine or Molière or something, were you? Or Corneille? Or...
Exactly.
I think it's hilarious. So how many languages do you speak? I mean, you speak English, you speak French, well, I mean, obviously English, but Spanish, French, Italian, German?
Yeah, very comfortable with, of course, English and French and Spanish. And less comfortable with good conversation in German, no problem, and Italian as well. I can get by.
And you could probably understand Portuguese and Catalan, a few things like that as well, could you?
Yes. I have to understand Catalan with our winery in Catalonia.
Yeah.
So that's useful. I don't really speak it, but I understand it.
I mean, apart from English, in which language do you feel most comfortable? You spent most of your life in France, haven't you?
In France, exactly, yes. No, French, absolutely. My wife is French too.
So do you speak French at home?
Yes,
yeah. Tell people that funny story about how you met your wife, that she'd actually broken down by the side of the road, hadn't she?
No, it wasn't her who was broken down. It was a girl who I'd met in the language school in Germany, in Cologne, who I hadn't seen for years. And she was from Bordeaux. I knew that. I also met her again in Madrid because she came to the same language school in Madrid. But then just one day driving in the Medoc, this was several years later, at least 6 years later, 1976, I think. I was in the Medoc because our office was in Margaux at that time. And I drove by and I saw a rather forlorn-looking girl looking at her car with a flat tire. And it happened to be this girl, and I helped her rent her tire. And in a thank you, she said, "Okay, I'm getting married in a week's time. Please come to my wedding," which I did. And that's where I met my wife.
Ah, okay, right. Okay, I got it confused. You started this career as an insurance broker. I bet you're glad you escaped doing that. And then you got a job in the wine business against the wishes of your dad. Your dad said, "You're not going to make any money doing this." And presumably he's right.
Yeah.
Wise words, right?
Right. But when he saw that I was determined, he had a very close friend who you may remember called John Surtees, who's a master of wine.
Yes, I do remember, yeah.
He was a very close friend of my father's, and they'd been at school together at Eton. And so he was an immense amount of help. He was working for Percy Fox at the time, and he said to me he couldn't give me employment, but he would give me a lot of assistance with traveling all over Europe, introducing me to his main suppliers. which he did.
So it was a second tour of Europe for you, but this time with a wine focus, wasn't it?
Wine focus, exactly. So I bought an old Beetle, Volkswagen Beetle, for £99 and drove all around Europe. And the first stop was Bordeaux. And then I spent there with Peter Sichel was my first stage, and I did another stage in Bordeaux with Mestreza. And then I went to the Loire Valley, Armagnac, Cognac.
Jerez, didn't you?
Yes, much later. There was Champagne,
much later.
Germany for a couple of months. And then Alsace, Burgundy, and ended up in Jerez and Bordeaux.
Very nice.
So during that trip, I found employment with Louis Echenard in Bordeaux. Yeah. And so, but I had a difficulty making a choice because the people in Jerez, which was the company was called Gave, which no longer exists, unfortunately, they offered me a job as well. So I had to choose between Jerez or Bordeaux. It was a tough choice.
And you chose Bordeaux. What was the wine trade like in the early 70s? I mean, was it much more, amateurish is probably the wrong word. Was it a bit more open to people like you in those days than it would be now?
Not really. No, it was rather the opposite. It was very sort of clubby and elitist at that time. It was, everybody knew each other. Everything was much more relaxed and a lot less pressure. People were more concentrated on building brands rather than actually selecting specific wines. It's a total revolution. The past 15 years has been an immense. It has been immense change in the wine trade. It's unrecognizable.
Yeah, and I suppose the wine world was much smaller in a sense then, wasn't it? I mean, people were focused on what we think of now as the classics.
Yes, those there were, and also the brands. That was the main thing in those days, was the brands and classic Bordeaux, exactly. And even in Burgundy, it was all négociant. Was hardly any estate wines at that time. No domain bottlings, or very few.
And what about things like Australia? Were people even talking about Australian wines?
No, there was no New World. At that time, there was actually no discussion about New World.
Not even California. This was
probably by the late 70s.
Yeah.
By the late 70s.
Yeah, California really got going with the judgment of Paris in 1976, I suppose.
Correct, yes. And that was a huge surprise.
Not least to the French.
Not least to the French, exactly.
So, what are the biggest changes you've seen in those 50 years then? Has it been the internationalization, if we could call that, of wine?
Yes, well, there's that too, but also changes in the structures of the trade, the rise of the supermarkets, the general spread of first of all, what's available. There's a huge amount of wines available that were not available at that time. We're seeing today new wineries appear on the scene almost every day, especially in countries like Spain and Italy. Perhaps not so much in France, but certainly in those countries. And the New World as well. The new wineries springing up all the time. So the choice is absolutely immense. Where in those days there wasn't that much choice. People sort of hung on to their favorites. They had their brands they liked, or they had their Grand Cru Classé. For example, Lynch Badge is an example in the UK. It's always been a favorite, and people would follow that, and were rather more conservative. The consumers were rather more conservative than they are today. Young people are more adventurous. I think there are a lot of new young sommeliers who are making headway and really making people more aware of more unusual wines, which is fine. And this is without discussing natural wines and wines without.
Yes,
alcohol,
exactly.
Which I don't.
Yeah. No, well, there we go. But you your first job was with Louis Echenard in Bordeaux. Had you already met Émile Peynaud by then? Was that on a previous trip, or was that on once you started there?
No, that was on the previous trip, the first trip I did. They had at that time at the Bordeaux University a weekly course, and I took a weekly course with Émile Peynaud, and that was wonderful because my French was okay, but it wasn't as good as it is today, and he was extremely articulate. It was very, very easy to understand him, and I still have my notes from that period, and it was fascinating. Yeah,
it's a shame. It's a shame that mobile phones didn't exist in those days. No one could have videoed it, or put it on YouTube or something like that.
Exactly. Yes. No, there was no way of doing that at that time. This was in 1970.
Yeah. I mean, your second job after Louis Echenau was with Frederick Wildman and Sons, and that was
Yes.
your introduction to Burgundy, wasn't it, really?
Particularly, yes, Burgundy, because that was one of their strong points. They were the agents for the Romanée-Conti and Lefebvre, and quite a few of the new, so to speak, estates which were just starting then, like Dujac, and also some of the older ones like Rousseau as well. There were a number of top names, which some of the wines had been represented by Wildman since the end of Prohibition. So they were very ingrained in the Burgundy market.
I mean, so you know both places very well, obviously. I mean, they're very different, as we all know. I mean, is there still that fierce rivalry between them? What explains that, do you think?
Not really anymore, no. In Bordeaux, there's some fantastic restaurants that have wonderful Burgundy lists now. In the 70s, 80s, there was no way you could find a bottle of Burgundy in Bordeaux. That's all changed.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it's the other way around, but there's some very good wine lists in Bordeaux.
I think you're right. It's probably harder to find Bordeaux and Burgundy. They're a bit more sort of chauvin in a way. Do you think the Burgundians maybe less international in a way? I mean, Burgundy is enclosed in a sense, isn't it? You know, it's a continental climate, whereas Bordeaux's always been maritime and open to the world, I suppose.
Yes. At the same time, for both regions, tourism has become of major importance, these both Burgundy and Bordeaux have opened up a lot over the years due to tourism.
Tell us how you came to create Europvin. I mean, who inspired you to do what you did? And just tell us what the idea.
Well, Europvin was very easy, really, because I was working with Frederick Wildman, and I was actually the European base, and they had an office in Margaux. I was given the charge of sourcing wines, negotiating with suppliers, and at the same time, they had interests in two companies in Europe. One was Moreau in Chablis, and the other was Cuny in Rioja. And they asked me to take care of the European sales in the 1970s, which was a tough period, as you can imagine, after the oil crisis and so on. But anyway, I traveled all over Europe in my little car and sold those wines. And suddenly, at the end of beginning of 78, they decided, the owners of Wildman, which were Hiram Walker, Canadian Club, and Courvoisier, they decided to close the European office. But they helped me set up Europvin. They gave me any excess stock at cost and things like that, and enabled me to basically auto-finance Europvin from the very first day. So I was very lucky in that respect. And Wildman also continued to buy wines from me for a time, and they helped me get Europvin underway. And then we gradually expanded it from there.
Yeah. So the decision was almost made for you in a way.
Exactly. It was an opportunity that I really couldn't miss.
Exactly. I mean, would you go looking for exciting new names yourself? I mean, did they find you, or did you go looking for them? I mean, I know at one point in the book you said you actually went and knocked on the door at Vega Sicilia, didn't you? Not that that's an exciting new name, but
yeah, I knocked on the door and met the winemaker at the time, and he was the one who put me in touch with Pablo Alvarez, who's the current managing director of the winery and of the owning family. And that was back in 1986. So the Alvarez family bought Vega Sicilia in 1982, and they put Pablo Alvarez in charge, I think it was in 1985 or 1986. And so I met him, and he came to Bordeaux to see who we were, and we started working together in the mid-80s. But I knew about Vega Sicilia before that.
Yes. You have done ever since, yeah.
Yes. And now Vega Sicilia is part owner of Europvin.
Yeah. Tell us about Becky Wasserman, one of the great figures of Burgundy, again, sadly no longer with us. How did you meet her, and how did you create Cannan? I hope I've got the pronunciation of your surname right, and Wasserman.
Yeah, it was through a wine journalist in America. You may remember him, called Robert Finnegan.
Yes,
he was a predecessor to Robert Parker, and was very successful until 1982, which he didn't like, but Parker did. That's what made the change. he put us in touch with each other, and I met Becky in Paris, and we got together a kind of very loose arrangement. We were never actually formally partners, in so to speak. The company was never created, but we traded under the name Cannan and Wasserman, sharing the commission. And that's how it worked. It was her suppliers, she got more commission, and it was our suppliers, we got more commission. That's how it worked. And until one day in 1986, one of our biggest customers, Barry Bassin in New York, went bankrupt and couldn't pay his suppliers. And so we had to struggle, each one on our own, to recuperate the cash to be able to pay the suppliers, which we did. We were able to pay all the suppliers. And Becky had to bring in some outside capital, which meant she had to change her strategy a bit. And I think that's why we couldn't continue, although it was a pity, because I think we could have made a major headway in the United States.
Yeah, I miss her. I had some good times with her. But tell us a bit more about Parker, because you got to know him in the early 80s when, as you said, he was made in many senses by the 82 vintage that he called it, right, in inverted commas. And he's very complimentary about you in his newsletter. Well, what was he like in those days? I mean, did you agree with his taste from the start? Were they always what they became, in a sense?
No, I think there's quite a lot of misconceptions about all that. I found him, I liked Parker a lot. He was very friendly. He loved what he did. He was so enthusiastic. He was always on time for tastings. He never late. And he just loved what he was doing. And that was always very positive. And what happened with us is we originally met him through Domaine de Vieux Telegraph, which we represented at the time in America. And we set up a visit for him there. And then he came to our office regularly, sometimes twice a year, because we could put 150 wines together for him to taste in one place. He never had time to go to all the different wineries. And so this for him was ideal. And he was an amazing taster. And how anybody can taste 150, even 1 year.
You said 200, didn't you?
200, yes.
200.
One tasting was 200, which even he, I think, found a bit difficult at the end, especially as the last one was an old Madeira from the 19th century. He found that a bit tough. But anyway, we always enjoyed it. We did tastings with him in Burgundy and also in the Rhone, and he always enjoyed it. And of course, everybody talks about Parker loving Napa wines, being heavily extracted, a lot of new oak. That was very much his what he loved. But at the same time, he also liked other wines. I mean, he made some mistakes in Burgundy, I think, but he loved Burgundy. But I did taste Burgundies with him, and he was very positive about them. But obviously that didn't fit very well with the Burgundians. But anyway, he was also very keen on the Rhone wines, and it wasn't always just heavily extracted wines. But,
so his palate was more diverse than people say, in a way.
Yes, it's more diverse. Yeah. People kind of put him in a box. I wouldn't say that was necessary.
I've never met him, but you do get that sense of enormous enthusiasm. That I think he's a wine lover. I don't think he was ever in it for the money or the fame, really.
No. He had a capacity to taste fast and make notes fast, and I was always amazed by the extensive notes he wrote, which were always very precise, and how little time he took over each wine. He was very rapid, but I think he had a unique capacity to taste at speed and absorb all the information he needed to absorb in record time. It was amazing to watch him.
I want to ask you a little bit about the relationship between producers and a wine merchant or broker, I suppose. They can be very close. And how difficult is it to sustain those relationships when you have to tell people the truth? If they've made a wine that you don't like very much, how do you do that? I mean, you have to be a real diplomat to kind of maintain those relationships and keep them going.
I guess there are occasions you have to be a diplomat, I guess, but we've never had. We've always been very careful about who we choose as a supplier, because it's not just the wines; it's also the people. It's very important to us, and people we felt we could work with over the long term. There are some people we worked with for 40 years without any problems, and then of course we would tell them if one of the wines we weren't happy with, we would tell them that we weren't happy with that particular wine, and but somehow we always tried to maintain the relationship. If the overall quality declined, then we would look for other sources. during the Europvin days.
And who have you had the closest relationship with over the years? Would it be someone like Pablo Alvarez from Vega?
Yes, I guess so, because we traveled a lot together. But there were also some other people who really influenced me in a big way. One was Gérard Jaboulet of Jaboulet, who we negotiated the agency. At least I negotiated the agency for the Jaboulet agency for Wildman back in the 80s, and that lasted for about 35 years. And but he helped me in a number of ways, introducing me to some of his customers who were looking for Bordeaux wines and things like that. And so we had a wonderful relationship with him. But then also the other big major relationship we had in the Rhone was Guigal. I'd met Guigal in the 70s, and it was in the 90s that Marcel Guigal said to us that after Kit Stevens had died, and he'd been the agents in Asia, and he asked me if Europvin could take care of Guigal in Asia as ambassadors for the brand, which Europvin is still doing today. And me and my daughter are ambassadors for Guigal in Spain. So we have a very close relationship with that Guigal family. And then in Spain, of course, with the Alvarez family, but also we had a wonderful relationship with Lustau, especially in the early days of our relationship, when Rafael Balao was the director, and he was the instigator of what we call the Almacenista series. He was always looking for ways of promoting sherry as a top quality product, which in those days was unusual. It was the only company really looking for unusual products in the sherry market. But today, of course, that's changing. All that's for the better as well, because more and more companies are looking for unusual sherries. And,
which is great.
Taking advantage of some wonderful stocks which still exist in Jerez.
It's interesting, as you've said, you've sold wine all over the world. Your love of travel that you developed as a teenager, really. Which have been the easiest and the hardest places to sell wines to?
Easiest, I guess the United States was probably the easiest from the point of view of actually talking to people and selling wines, because the Americans are always very open and enthusiastic, and they were always keen to try new things. In some ways, that was easy. Of course, the bureaucracy and the red tape was complicated. More difficult was Japan. Japan was always a little complicated. It always took a long time to get things up and running in Japan. But once they were up and running, they were always very loyal, and they continued to buy constantly. They were much loyaler than any other market. Other markets.
What about the protocols?
Sorry?
Were the protocols difficult in Japan?
Yes, protocol, and it's all a bit, one has to be very careful, very polite, and it's, but it's fun, and I enjoyed it. I learned a lot in Japan, and love going back there anytime I get an opportunity. It's an amazing culture. At that time, of course, it's much more different now. They've become more westernized in the past 2 or 3 decades, but before, in the 1980s, it was still really rather backward in their thinking.
Terra incognita, yeah.
Yes. But Australia was another market that was very successful. Brazil as well. I love going there.
I want to talk to you a little bit about winemakers, because you've known and indeed worked with some of the greatest winemakers, over the 20th and still going into the 21st century. What sets them apart, I wonder? And do they have things in common? Do you look at somebody and say, okay, I can see that these people think in a similar way, or taste in a similar way, or approach business in a similar way? Anything that you see linking them?
Yes, the approach is a bit different in each country. The approach in Japan is, I guess, taste is very important to them. Everything has to be absolutely in their line of thinking, and they love Burgundy, for example, because of its the finesse, the elegance, the perfection. They're always looking for perfection.
No, I was asking more about winemakers, about whether you see things in common between the winemakers.
Between winemakers.
Between great winemakers, yeah. Great winemakers, yeah.
Yes, no, also winemakers, as we know, that each one has an opinion on how to make wine, and each one is different. You can talk to any winemaker, and one will say everything in wood, another will say everything in concrete, another will say everything in stainless steel, and they always consider it's the best. And but anyway, I think winemaking, a lot of importance attached to that, and it may have differences in the nuance, but not an immense amount of difference.
So is it self-belief in a way that these people have the self-belief to think that what they're doing is right and the best?
Yes. Uh-huh. Oh, yes. Yes. I think not everybody, but quite a few winemakers are very convinced in their own attitude to how they make their wine.
I mean, and you're a winemaker yourself. I mean, how did you come to buy Clos Figueras in Priorat? I mean, in the book, sounds like a bargain. You paid £40,000 for 10 hectares of land, right?
Yes, it had been a vineyard before; it had been abandoned, but we were able to recuperate some of the vines. It was through René Barbier. I discovered Priorat long before what we call the new wave of producers there in the 84, 85 period, when there was only one estate actually exporting wine, and that was Scala Dei. We started exporting Scala Dei in the 80s. And then later in 89, I met Alvaro Palacios in New York at the New York Wine Experience. He said to me, it wasn't the right place to talk about it, but he invited me to dinner in Logroño and told me about what we call the new wave of producers. And at the end of the conversation, he said he didn't need our services as Europvin to export his wines, but René Barbier of Clos Figueras did need help exporting his wines outside Europe. So we linked up with René and we started exporting his wines practically from the first vintage, which was 1989, of the new wave of producers. And then in 1997, he said to me that there was this bit of land for sale, and I'd just inherited some money, and sort of, why not spend it? And since it was very inexpensive, as you saw at that time, everything else is very expensive, of course, is the terracing, planting, actually making the wines and so on. But the actual land at that time was very inexpensive. And today you could still buy land quite cheaply, but it would be it wouldn't have been planted.
No, exactly. But you've turned it into a very famous brand. Has it been fun making wine, getting your hands dirty?
Yes, it's been fun. We'll continue. Yes, I'm lucky. I have my daughter with me to help, and she's very enthusiastic, very much involved with the commercial side of the business, and also with the women winemakers movement in Spain, and she really founded that.
So when did she go into wine? I mean, did she study in Bordeaux or in Spain?
She studied in Spain. She did the sommelier school. She did WSET and various other things. And studied on the spot, but she did winemaking in Australia with Yalumba, in Argentina, and in Italy with Isole and Elena.
And you expanded the business, didn't you, from Priorat into neighbouring Montsant as well, again with René?
Well, we have a joint venture with René. It's a separate business of a wine called Espectacle, which is
fantastic wine.
120-year-old vines planted just after phylloxera, and it's called Espectacle, and it is spectacular. The vineyard.
I agree with you. It really is.
You can see the Pyrenees from there.
We talked about what the wine world was like in the 70s, and you said it was focused on the classics and on brands. Is the wine world, the fine wine world, becoming less conservative with the small C? I mean, places like Priorat now drunk at the top table alongside top Bordeaux and Burgundies and I don't know, Mosel wines and things like that.
Yes. Oh, I think so. I think there's much more. It's a lot less conservative than it used to be. Absolutely. People are much more open-minded. I think that's a lot to do with the sommeliers. A lot of dynamic sommeliers who've become enthusiastic and have known how to communicate. And many of them are no longer sommeliers. They've become consultants and have a major role to play in influencing the market. Also, some very dynamic wine merchants all over the world who have made selections of some of the finest wines in each specific area. That's always been our philosophy, is always to choose the best wines we could find in each area. And the idea behind Europvin was to have to represent every top appellation of Spain, but with the very top wines. This led us to having allocations of some of the very finest estates, especially in the Rhône. We had allocations of Chateau Reas, of Chave, and Jamais, various other top estates, and in Burgundy there were about 20 estates which we represented and had allocations of, which are historic appellations, and Europvin still has these allocations today.
Very nice.
From the top domains.
I should get one.
Yeah.
Tell me about tasting wine, because, I mean, I've looked through the list of some of the things you've tasted, particularly in Burgundy. My mouth was watering reading your book. I mean, a vertical of Romanée-Conti, I mean, that's pretty rare. Is there any event in your life that stood out where you just thought, I can't believe this is me sitting here tasting these wines?
That's right, yes. Well, since we represented Romanée-Conti in Spain through Pablo Alvarez, and as Pablo didn't speak French, I was lucky enough to be invited to the biennial event when the domain invited their importers. And at each event, there was a different tasting. And the most memorable was certainly the last one I went to, I think it was in 2015, when it was a vertical of the Romanée-Conti itself back to the 1920s. And it was sensational. Absolutely sensational. But there were other ones too. There was a vertical of Morachet on another occasion. There was a vertical of La Tâche, of course. And all these tastings were memorable in every respect.
Yeah, and it doesn't pay to sit there and think, I wonder how much these bottles are worth, does it?
Yes, one doesn't ask that question.
No, exactly. Anywhere else where you've been present at sort of historic tastings? I mean, anything in Spain?
Yes, a number of tastings in Spain. A vertical of Vega Sicilia, also back to the 20s, back to 1919. On one occasion, and a number of other occasions too, I've had the luck and chance to be able to taste verticals of Vega Sicilia, but also I've had wonderful tastings in Jerez of older sherries, and tastings also of wines from areas like Montilla, where you can taste wines again back to the 19th century. I've had tastings in Madeira as well, which have been wonderful. And, I'm very fond of the great fortified wines of the world.
I mean, you've had this very long relationship with Spain, going back to your first visit. I think you said to Jerez, where you thought, should I stay in Jerez or should I go to Bordeaux to work for Echelon instead? Do you think Spain's moment has come? I love Spain too, obviously, and I'm very enthusiastic about Spain as a fine wine producer, but it's very hard to shift the dial to change its image. I think, is that finally happening, do you think?
I think it is. I think there's definitely. I think with the quality that's coming out of Spain now, I think people do realize that's a double situation. There's a situation of still inexpensive wines that are shipped in bulk in large quantities, but at the same time, there are some top wines that are world class. And not just Vega Sicilia. We now have wines which have hit the headlines, like the Hermita from the Priorat, Pingus from the Ribera del Duero. These are now very expensive, in the top league of the wines of the world. So Spain is up there, definitely. And the image, I think, is gradually changing. In some countries, less so than others, but
yeah, I think so.
Some countries are more so. But I think in the UK, I think people are now more open to tasting wines of higher quality from Spain, and the image has changed. There is a danger that Rioja is become too much of a brand, and people don't look out for the better wines from Rioja. They just buy Rioja for the name. But I think at the same time, there's some wonderful Riojas being made, and they are being exported to the UK.
I agree. Last question. I mean, you're retired now, although as you say in the book, you never really retire from wine. It kind of stays in your blood, doesn't it? How do you spend your time now? I know you're still involved in Priorat with Clos Figueras and Europvin. Very
much involved with the export side of Clos Figueras. We're in 35 countries, very diverse. I go to the States occasionally, and I visit the European markets, and my daughter does the same. She helps me, especially in America, but also in Spain.
And Europvin, are you still running that?
No, I'm no longer involved on an executive basis. I do have one share, but that's it. That's it. And we're still on very friendly terms since the new owners are two of our main suppliers. One is Vega Sicilia, who owns 50%, and Lustau owns the other 50%.
Okay, well, that's great. And it's given you time to write a book. This wonderful book that I enjoyed reading very much, which is called A Journey in the World of Wine. It's available from all good booksellers, and in that unmentionable place you can buy books from online. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your amazing knowledge and this overview you've had for 50 years in the wine trade, looking back over it. It's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much.
Me too. And I hope to see you soon. And again, continue the conversation. It's been
over a good bottle.
Yes, exactly. I'll find a nice bottle. With pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a good trip to South Africa.
Thank you. What a privilege to interview one of the wine trade's most respected figures. I'm glad Christopher never made it to Perth. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Kate McIntyre MW from Mooradook Estate in Australia's Mornington Peninsula. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.